and welcome back. You're at that stage of your preparation for your external exam where you're probably finishing your first in-class reading of the play. And by this time, I'm hoping that you've also probably connected with some of the other resources that we've supplied you with, so that you may have finished another reading of the play in your own time. You've watched a film adaptation so that you can see some variations in characterization and, more importantly, some elements of characterization that have been maintained in every version of the play. You've read some of the additional resources that we've provided you with to help build your background knowledge of the play. And now you're at that point that you're ready to start a deep reading, preparing to analyse individual aspects of the play for the way that Shakespeare uses them to achieve their purpose, achieve his purpose. Now, in the English syllabus, we're required specifically to connect our analysis to the use of writers' tools. And we have used the language of writers' tools in two different ways this year. Aesthetic features and stylistic devices. So I want to take the time in this little tutorial to revisit what it is that we mean when we say stylistic devices, and what we mean when we say aesthetic features, and how I can use them in isolation, and how I can use them together to form my analysis in response to a question that I will eventually be asked. So I'm going to draw your attention, first of all, to the Padlet that we've already shared with you, and which is mapping out our road to external assessment by focusing on the building of our knowledge around the play, the building of our knowledge contextually, so the world that created the play, eventually getting to the point where we're also revising our knowledge of how to write an essay and how to structure an argument. So this document about stylistic features and, stylistic devices and aesthetic features comes directly from the QCAA General English Syllabus, but you can find it on our Padlet. So let us have a look. So here is our Padlet, and I've already maximised the document so that you can see it. And this is specifically looking at the idea of aesthetic features, stylistic devices in use in analytical essays. Now, this little document actually has aesthetic features first and stylistic devices second, but I'm going to focus on stylistic devices first because we've already connected with the idea of the building blocks of a play, the anatomy of a play, and the stylistic devices link really directly to that. So it makes sense to start there and then look at aesthetic features. So I'm just going to draw your attention to the start of this definition for stylistic devices here, about halfway down the page. Style refers to the distinct ways in which the aspects of a text are arranged, the ways that particular techniques and forms have been used to create an imagined reality. Okay, so these are the building blocks that we associate with form, that we associate with text structures. So we know that if we were studying a narrative, we would expect to see characters setting plot. We would expect to see a complication. We could look for symbols. We know that there's going to be an element of narration. We could expect that there's going to be a moral. We might see a motif used. So we're still going to see all of those because Macbeth is still essentially a narrative, but because it's a narrative arranged as a play, where the intention was originally, of course, that it would be performed live, we have very specific text structures associated with the creation of characters where they're going to be portrayed by a living actor. The creation of a story where things have to happen quickly and where the main characters need to be the focus without a lot of background information, because I'm not going to stand and tell you the story while nothing happens on the stage. Okay? So let's have a look at some examples then of what we mean when we say stylistic devices. So text structures, the building blocks of a text, how those are put together, manipulates an audience to see a version of reality as the author intends us to see it. Now, there are many different plays by many different authors. They don't all encourage us to see the same thing. So we know that there's something else that has to happen as well, but text structures refer to the way in which the building blocks are put together. We also have elements like juxtaposition. Now, we absolutely will need to have a working understanding of the idea of juxtaposition for our study of Macbeth, because we get to understand that Macbeth is a tyrant because he is compared to Duncan, and eventually Malcolm taking the throne is compared to the tyranny of Macbeth. So the idea of the ramming together of two contrasting ideas for effect, which is what juxtaposition is something we know that we're going to need to be able to talk about quite comfortably in our study of Macbeth. We have approaches to narration. So while we obviously mostly focus on the main characters, the fact that we actually have scenes where lords like Ross and Lennox have a chance to tell us about the ways that the world is reacting to Macbeth's rule, the fact that we have a scene from the porter whose delivery reflects the irony of letting evil in when, of course, the evil was already inside his house. Those little scenes provide us with changes in narration, and that narration lets us see how the actions of our leading characters are actually affecting the lives of the ordinary people. We see approaches to characterization. Now, this is our bread and butter. We have to be able to look at the idea of how a character is put together, how they are manipulated to show change, how they interact with other characters, and the ways in which those interactions lead to good outcomes or bad outcomes. So the creation of, the building of your own understanding of characterization is absolutely your priority as soon as you finish your first reading of the play. Use of figurative devices, use of rhetorical devices like repetition. We see that quite frequently. The fact that it's used purposefully means that we didn't have a typo. We didn't write a word twice or three times by accident. It's there for a reason. So why was it repeated? What's the significance of that particular word that it had to be said more than once? When we look at something like the control of sentence length or form, well, we're looking more at the use of rhyme and rhythm. So how is iambic pentameter used? When does it break down? Why does it break down? Literary patterns, sound devices, and visual devices. Okay, so if I go back to the top of the page, we can then look at what aesthetic features are about. So aesthetic features, if we read along with the definition there, allow us to rehearse different ways of seeing the world and different emotional reactions. Okay, so if I'm able to use the ways that words are put together on a page to actually access a different emotional reaction, then there's something about the construction of those words on a page that's actually inviting me to use or to explore a different set of values, attitudes, and beliefs. Because the way we react to the world is as a response to our own values. Okay, so if the way that language is put together lets me rehearse different emotional responses, I'm actually being, the language choices have been so nuanced that I'm being invited to actually explore different values. So the aesthetic is far more than that which is simply beautiful. And you know, if you've been in my classes, then you know that that's a point that I've emphasized, that aesthetic features are functional and elegant, okay, functional and beautiful. So they've got to do two things to be truly aesthetic. And it refers to the complex relationship between perception and sensation. All right, so we know that they're literally words on a page. There's nothing terribly unique about the organization of letters printed in black ink on white paper. But through the way that my eyes see those words and the organization of those words and the selection of those words, my brain and my emotions can then perceive a very specific version of reality. And that is why we always talk about choosing our words so carefully, because we can position an audience to see a very specific, very select version of a character rather than a really broad and vague kind of archetype. Aesthetic features and stylistic devices, which we collectively can refer to as writers' tools, refer to those aspects of a text that prompt emotional and critical responses. So emotional and critical responses. An emotional response tends to be immediate. It's almost involuntary, and it feels, you can imagine it's the way that you react to being punched in the stomach. It's automatic that you do something. And an emotional response is one that I that I perceive with my heart, as opposed to a critical response, which tends to be a little bit more measured. It may not be immediate. It may actually come as the result of reflection. And those are the responses that invite us to ask questions. So I often do this little demonstration in classes that an emotional response is kind of like a response, I've been hit in the stomach, where a critical response is more like a huh. So I'm thinking about what I've seen and how it's making me feel. All right, so then aesthetic features can take a lot of forms, actually. And I'm going to show you another really, really useful resource to support your understanding here, because our aesthetic devices, we could almost collectively identify as our literary devices, because we're looking at the written word. They are the more common ones, like alliteration, assonance, metaphor, personification. There are some additional ones that you might have heard of but might not necessarily have used, things like irony, certainly ones you have heard and have used, ones like representation. And that's important to us because we need to understand that while we know Macbeth was a historical character, as was Banquo, this is not the whole life of Macbeth faithfully and accurately recorded. This is a version of one chapter in that man's life, used specifically to position us to see what a bad king looks like. So it's a representation of poor leadership, not the biography of the man of Macbeth. Okay, so that's the key element of representation. And then we need to look at what's been put in and what's been left out to form that representation. And there are a couple of other devices that are very important to the study of a play like Macbeth, where we're accessing something that was written many years ago, and there are elements like allusions to Greek mythology, Christian scripture, references to the humours, the four humours, so that we get a connection to the way society made sense of the world in the 1600s, even though it's not necessarily the language that we would use to make sense of the world today. Okay, so I'm going to show you this other resource, and I strongly recommend that you add this website to your list of bookmarks and that you do visit it. It is a very creatively named page called Literary Devices and Terms. Conservatively, there are about 500 different literary devices listed here. Most of them you are not going to need to know, but the fact that each of them is listed and includes a definition and a number of examples makes our use of them really much more efficient. And so I would expect that your teachers are going to start to identify some key ones for you and encourage you to annotate your script with examples of their use. Okay, so one that I might straight away make reference to is this one. All right, chiasmus. So chiasmus, as we may have already identified in previous tutorials, is a rhetorical device where two or more clauses are balanced against each other. Fair is foul and foul is fair. This particular stylistic device is central to us understanding that there is the perception of chivalry, or the perception of goodness, but what is hidden underneath is actually quite poisonous, and that is played out for us in a number of different ways across the course of the script. If I jump back, I'm also going to make reference to one other one right now, because it's going to be relevant to my very next tutorial, and that is the idea of pathetic fallacy. So pathetic fallacy, if you've not heard it before, is actually the idea of the real world, the physical world, becoming a manifestation of the way I feel, or the way human choices are impacting the world. So in the case of Macbeth, pathetic fallacy can refer to the way that the horses eat each other and the falcons are attacked by mousing owls and the chimneys fall down, because Macbeth's rule is so poor and so unlike what is required. Okay, so that's it for this little tutorial. If you know that there are aspects of aesthetic features and stylistic devices that you need to revise, I strongly recommend that you go back and connect with anatomy of a play for the ways in which the text is put together, so our stylistic devices, and something like the literarydevices.net website that highlights a whole range of aesthetic features that you can actually learn about and then find in your script, with the purpose of being able to talk about why you think Shakespeare used them. So there's no point just identifying them. You're identifying them with the view to then be able to say, and Shakespeare's used this for this reason, because that is the heart of our work. Okay, so in our next tutorial, we're going to start deconstructing the characters very specifically. So if you are at the point where you have not yet finished the play, you need to make that your priority, because from now on in, we are working with our script. We're turning it very much into a living document that shows the progression of our understanding of the characters, the progression of our understanding of the arrangement of the scene, so why this happens here, so that by the end of week 6, we feel that we can really flexibly answer just about any question that's posed. All right, till then, see you later.